Mỹ Sơn is a cluster of Hindu temples left over from the Indian-influenced Champa civilization that was built between the late 300s and the 1400s. Talking about a civilization which once ruled over what's now the central and southern portion of Vietnam, going back to a time when, until the 11th century at least, present-day northern Vietnam was still part of China. Mỹ Sơn was the cultural and religious center of the Cham people for nearly 1,000 years, at a time when the political capital of the Champa Empire was located just a few kilometers away. The place has the distinction of being the longest inhabited archaeological site on the mainland of Southeast Asia, which is sort of ironic given the relative obscurity of the place. In case you're wondering, the Champa civilization, which spent the early part of its existence fighting against the Chinese, didn't completely die out in Vietnam. It almost did. Almost the last vestiges of it disappeared by the 1830s when the then Kingdom of Vietnam finished its suppression. Today in Vietnam, there still exists, of course, Champa people, very small in number, believed to be only a few thousand, mostly living in and around Ho Chi Minh City, but a few near here in central Vietnam, near this sacred, historic, and religious center. What you see here is relatively a small part of the ruins that remain from a much larger inventory. Unfortunately, during the Vietnam War, American air raids destroyed the majority of this archaeological site in a single week of bombing. Among the structures decimated by the bombs was the largest and most important single temple on these grounds, reduced to nothing but a pillar and some tumbling walls. There's something especially appealing about what's left of these once great temples because of a couple of things. One, while they're reminiscent of the famed Borobudur temples in Indonesia and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, they're not as well known, even though they were every bit as important. And secondly, these ruins, at least not yet, are not among the A-list of international tourism sites. And so walking about these grounds has more of an intimate feeling, and you get the sense that you're discovering something. Not to defend the bombing of antiquity sites, but the then North Vietnamese forces weren't exactly blameless themselves. They chose to locate a command center within the temple grounds, which within the context of warfare was more or less an invitation for aerial bombardment. There were originally 71 temples on this site, as well as numerous stelae bearing important inscriptions in Sanskrit and in the Cham language. There are only a handful of the temples that exist anywhere near completeness these days, and they've been restored. While international entities and the Vietnam government have made efforts to prevent further deterioration of these monuments, it is still an uphill struggle. I'm in the oldest part of this temple complex, which was built between the 4th and the 7th century. These temples were pretty much all dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva, which comes as no surprise since the Cham Kingdom originated with peoples from the Indian subcontinent, or at least mixed with them, so that Hinduism became the official religion. Of course, Shiva was known under a variety of different names, and among the Cham people here, Shiva came to be referred to as Bhadrashvara. This structure that I'm standing in was built most likely in the late 300s or in the 400s CE, and would have been a place to service the Champa king's visit to this most holy place in the Champa religion. In fact, in the very next small temple, the door of which you can see behind me, was a place where only the king was to enter. He did so on a monthly basis and performed holy rituals there in the early parts of the Champa Empire. The oldest parts that date to the 4th century. You see no moss on the brickwork, but immediately beside it, where reconstruction has taken place, and primarily in this spot, the Vietnamese enlisted the assistance of and the generosity of the Polish government in the 1990s to restore this portion of the ruins. And nobody among the experts could figure out how to reconstruct the brick stonework here without introducing moss to it. But the 4th century, as opposed to the 20th century, structure is in stark contrast, because the 4th century, the way the stones are together allow no growth, and yet just below them or beside them you see the moss, and that's a telltale sign of restoration.
Here is broken by the bomb here. So the king of the Champa people, he will stand here to play the worship the Shiva. Have a man, have a women. The king put the water in the sand. But this temple here is later, from the 13th century.
I've moved up into the 13th century shrine that was really the province of a later Champa king. You go to a splendid place of antiquity like this, in many places in the world, you can't enter something like this. It's become more restrictive at antiquity sites. And yet here, you can still roam freely. And you've got to love that about this place.
More than 1,000 years. And all the brick here is made by the handmade, not any of the materials. We got the car from build the temple here from there.
The bomb crater and the 8th century temple that was shredded by the bomb that fell in this crater reminds me again that this place has undergone great restoration over the years, but is far from complete. And it's been an international effort. There have been numerous countries that have participated in the last century or so, really. Even the French, when they occupied Vietnam, spent a lot of effort working here, securing many of the artifacts that were here, many of which, by the way, are in the Champa Museum, quite a grand place in Da Nang. In later times, the Poles became very active. The Polish government, private foundations, in the 1990s, along with the Indians, French, Germans, Italians. There really has been an international effort to try and restore some of the splendor of this important place of antiquity. But absent restoration work here is the United States, which I find a bit ironic, since it was American bombs that did the most damage to this place. Besides its historic interest, this is really a beautiful place. A tropical forest with banana trees and a variety of exotic fruits and other trees. If you come to Da Nang, you should by all means visit this place. You take a tour. Tours run from Da Nang. They also run from Hoi An. So from either of those places, one can visit Mỹ Sơn.
You visit a place like Mỹ Sơn, and you're reminded that civilizations come and go. And if they're lucky, at least there are remains, even if those remains are scarred with bomb craters.